The great orbital ring of the galactic consensus shimmered like a vast, metallic river under the light of a dozen different suns. Ships from 1,000 species drifted in and out of the docks in a silent, orderly ballet. It was a place of cold logic, of polished protocols, and of quiet assessments. Humanity was a recent entry into this grand, star-spanning union, a small voice in a chorus of ancient civilizations. They were seen as clever, adaptable, but ultimately fragile. They had no deep history, no epic myths that spanned the void. Their stories, the consensus scholars had concluded, were simple planetary folklore. Charming and primitive, Lee Haniel felt that assessment keenly as she walked through the echoing corridors of Dock Sector 7. Her job as a xenolinguist was often that of a translator of technical manuals, a facilitator of minor trade disputes. It was important work, but it was not the work of legend. She adjusted her simple gray jumpsuit, the standard human attire on the station, and watched a Velm cargo hauler, its shell-like hull glistening, maneuver with precise hydraulic grace. She was here to meet a returning deep-range scout, a routine mission of welcome and preliminary debrief. The ship was not supposed to be here. Not this one. A sharp atonal alarm blared through the sector, a sound reserved for unscheduled, high-priority arrivals. The graceful dance of the docks stuttered. Haniel stopped, her hand going to the cool wall for support. On the massive viewing port at the end of the corridor, a shape resolved from the star-dotted blackness. It was a ship, but it was wrong. It was human in design, a scout-class vessel designated the Mumbai, but it looked like a carcass that had been dragged through a cosmic reef. Its silver hull was pocked and scarred. Long, parallel gouges, deep and ragged as if from monstrous claws, ran along its port side. The burns on its stern were not the clean marks of plasma weaponry. They were blackened, fractal blooms of corrosion. A profound silence fell over the dock control chatter. The Mumbai had been listed as missing, presumed lost, for 3 standard cycles. Its mission had been a long-shot survey into the fringes of the region known only as the Dark. It was an empty, terrifying quadrant where sensors failed, where comms died, and from which no ship had ever returned. Until now, the docking procedure was agonizingly slow. The Mumbai moved like a wounded animal, its thrusters coughing sporadic bursts. When it finally settled into the clamps with a shuddering groan that vibrated through the deck plates, the usual welcoming party of medics and technicians hesitated. The ship exhaled a plume of frozen gases, and something else, a scent of ozone, burnt metal, and a faint, coppery tongue. The main hatch opened, not with a pressurized hiss, but with a grinding shriek of protesting metal. The crew emerged. There were 12 of them, the full complement. This, more than anything, shocked Haniel. They should be dead. They walked, but it was the walk of ghosts. Their faces were pale, drawn tight over their bones. Their eyes, which should have held the relief of homecoming, were hollow, fixed on some middle distance only they could see. They did not look at the waiting med-droids. They did not speak. At their head was Commander Kim Tae-yun. Haniel knew him from his service record, a picture of steady competence. The man who now stood before the gathering crowd of stunned aliens and a few humans was a stranger. His hair was shot with gray that hadn't been there before. His uniform, usually impeccable, was stained and torn at the shoulder. He held himself rigidly, as if any relaxation would cause him to shatter. Ambassador Vural, the senior Velm diplomat for the sector, scuttled forward, his multi-jointed legs tapping a rapid, nervous rhythm on the deck. His chitinous face was unreadable to most, but Haniel could detect the faint ripple of unease in his antennae. Commander Kim. Bull's voice translated through the ambient speakers, smooth and diplomatic. The consensus welcomes your return. Your survival is unexpected. We have medical teams standing by. A full debriefing will, of course, be scheduled at your convenience. Kim Taeyeon's eyes slowly focused on the Vel. He didn't bow. He didn't salute. He opened his mouth, his lips cracked and dry, and when he spoke, his voice was a rusted file dragged over stone. "Thank you, Ambassador." A small crowd had gathered now curious car, with their crystalline bodies refracting the light. A pair of floating sylphi in their containment suits, various station personnel. A news drone hovered silently, its lens focused on the broken commander. The drone's operator, a sleek avian sow, chirped a question that translated. "Commander Kim, can you tell us what happened in the dark? How did you survive where others vanished?" Kim turned his head toward the drone. The movement was stiff. The hollows of his eyes seemed to deepen. The dock's ambient lighting cast harsh shadows across his face. He took a slow, deliberate breath, as if summoning strength not from his body, but from some deep, painful well of memory. "We survived," he said, each word heavy and distinct, "by remembering the old stories." A faint ripple of confusion passed through the alien onlookers. The translator repeated the words in various galactic tongues. "The old stories?" The Tsia operator prompted. "The legends," Kim Taeyeon continued, his gaze now drifting past the drone, past the crowd, towards the viewing port and the infinite black beyond it. "The ones from Earth, the ones we tell in the dark, the ones our ancestors whispered to keep the night at bay." He paused, and a profound, weary certainty settled on his features. They were true. For a moment, there was only the hum of the station's life support. Then, a soft, chittering sound rose from the Velm contingent. It was laughter. Polite, disbelieving laughter. Ambassador Verl made a gentle, pacifying gesture with a claw. "A commendable metaphor for resilience, Commander," Verl said, his tone kindly but dismissive. "The trauma of deep space isolation is well documented. The mind seeks patterns, meaning, in sensory deprivation. To frame your ordeal in the context of your species, colorful fables is understandable." Other aliens nodded, their postures relaxing. The mystery had a comforting psychological explanation. Human fragility, both physical and mental, was once again confirmed, but Haniel did not relax. She was watching Commander Kim's face. She saw no relief at the explanation, no gratitude for the offered excuse. She saw only a bone-deep exhaustion and a flicker of something else, a pity, profound and terrifying, directed at Verl and all the others who laughed. It was the look of a man who had seen a fire engulfing a house, while those inside debated the color of the curtains dot as the med droids gently but firmly began to guide the catatonic crew away. Kim's eyes swept across the small cluster of human personnel. They met Haniel's for a fraction of a second. In that instant, the message was clear, and it froze the blood in her veins. He was not speaking in metaphors. He was giving a warning, and no one was listening. The official report, issued by consensus before the day was done, cited extreme environmental hazards and protracted systems failure as the cause of the Mumbai's damage and the crew's psychological state. The story of the human commander and his legends became a minor curiosity, amusing anecdote in the station's vast, humming tapestry of data. The claw marks on the hull were attributed to a collision with a unique crystalline asteroid. The bizarre energy signatures were logged as sensor ghosts. Lee Haniel returned to her small quarters that night. The station, with its endless, reassuring cycles, felt different. The darkness outside the viewport in her room seemed thicker, more attentive. She pulled up an archive, something she hadn't looked at since her childhood on Earth. A collection of folk tales, myths, and legends. Stories of shapes in the mountains, voices in the forests, creatures that fed on fear and iron, fairy tales to keep children from wandering off. She stared at the words, and for the first time, they did not feel like stories. They felt like instructions. And somewhere, in the silent, scarred heart of the docked Mumbai, she knew they were the only reason anyone was still alive to laugh. The sterile, white light of the Consensus Medical Wing did nothing to warm Commander Kim Tae-yun. He sat on the edge of an examination platform, his posture still rigid, while a multi-limbed medical droid hummed and scanned him for the third time. The physical scans, Ambassador Verl had explained with polite firmness, were a necessary precursor to the psychological evaluation. The official story was being written around him. The brave, traumatized crew, victims of a terrible but natural cosmic phenomenon. Across the station, in a cramped data analysis cubicle that smelled of recycled air and ozone, Lee Haniel could not let it go. The look in Kim's eyes haunted her. She had requested the raw sensor logs from the Mumbai, citing a standard linguistic review for anomalous communication patterns. Her request was buried, then denied. The Velm technocrats in charge of the investigation had declared the data corrupted and unusable, a common fate for electronics. That spent too long in the strange tides of the Dark Haniel found Park, Jia, in the station's main archive hub. Jia was a data archaeologist, her focus on reconstructing fragmented histories from damaged digital records. She was also Haniel's closest friend on the station, a woman with sharp eyes and a mind that enjoyed puzzles. "They're hiding it," Haniel said quietly, pulling up a chair next to Jia's cluttered terminal. "Or they're just not looking the right way." Jia glanced around. The hub was mostly empty. The official report is already being finalized. Consensus doesn't like messy stories. Sensor failure is a nice, clean ending. "It's not the ending," Haniel insisted. Kim said they remembered the old stories. What if? What if the data isn't corrupted in a normal way? What if it's coded? Not in a machine language, but in a story language? Jia raised an eyebrow. "You've been breathing too much recycled air." But her fingers were already dancing across her terminal. "All right. Let's play a game." The Velm use harmonic validation. They look for data patterns that resonate with known physical laws. If something breaks those laws, their filters toss it out as noise. She brought up a complex, garbled stream of symbols, the publicly listed fragment of the Mumbai's final log. It was just static. But human data storage, especially on deep-range scouts, has old, deep-layer protocols. From the early days, backup upon backup. Some of it is mythic. Mythic? Sure, Jia said. Early programmers used cultural touchstones as encryption keys. Nursery rhymes, folktales. A layer of security based on shared subconscious knowledge. She began to run a new set of programs, not consensus standard, but human-designed, pulling algorithms from Earth's pre-spaceflight era. If something attacked the Mumbai on a level that breaks physical laws, maybe the only parts of the ship's mind that could even perceive it were the oldest, most instinctual layers. The parts that remember fairy tales. The process was slow. Hours ticked by. They worked in silence, the only sound the hum of Jia's terminal and the distant, rhythmic thrum of the station's gravity generators. Finally, the screen flickered. The static twisted, resolved, and broke apart like ice on a pond. Got an audio channel unlocked first. It was not from the bridge. It was from the lower engineering deck. They heard the frantic shouts of the crew, a scream of metal under stress. And then another sound, a low, guttural vibration that was not a machine. It was a voice, or something like a voice, speaking in no language the universal translator could parse. It repeated a phrase, a snarling, clicking chain of sounds that made the hair on Haniel's arms stand up. Beneath the fear in the human shouts, Haniel heard something else. A rhythmic chanting. Desperate, repetitive words in Korean. Jidero Doraga? Chidero Doraga? Go back the way you came. The ship's aye, Gia whispered, her face pale in the terminal's glow. It's using a ward. A folk ward against evil spirits. The visual data was worse. Gia managed to stitch together fractured spectrographs and distorted LiDAR returns. The images were not of ships. They were vast, shifting shapes that seemed to bleed at the edges. One moment it was a cloud of dark mist, the next it resolved into a jagged, multi-limbed silhouette that moved with a terrible, unnatural grace. It was organic, but not like any creature known to biology. It was a shape made of shadow and sharp angles. Haniel felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She fumbled with her personal pad, accessing the archive of myths she had been reading. She scrolled past tales of goblins and mountain gods, her fingers trembling. She stopped on an entry from the Korean peninsula, a creature from a myth so old its origins were dust. The Bulgasari, a being born of resentment and darkness that fed on iron and grew stronger with fear. She had seen a child's drawing of it in the archive. Slowly, she turned her pad and held it up next to Gia's screen. On the pad was a stylized ancient etching of a monstrous creature, part bear, part boar, with glowing eyes and a hide of metallic scales. On the terminal was a blurred, horrifyingly real spectrograph outline pulled from the Mumbai's dying sensors. The silhouette of a massive, hulking shape, its maw open near the ship's hull, where the deepest claw marks were. The shapes were not identical. One was a child's nightmare from a storybook. The other was a sensor ghost from the edge of hell. But the posture, the suggestion of a jagged, armored form, the sense of a creature that consumed. They were cousins. They were the same idea, seen through two different lenses. It can't be, Gia breathed, her scientific mind rebelling. It's coincidence. Pareidolia. We're seeing patterns because we're looking for them. Are we? Haniel's voice was barely a whisper. She pointed to the audio log timestamp. The crew chanted a ward. The AI used a folktale protocol. The ship's sensors, in their most basic form, saw that. She tapped the image of the mythic creature. What if the dark isn't just empty space? What if it's a place that reacts to thought? To belief? And the only beliefs strong enough to shape anything out there are the oldest, strongest ones we have? Our nightmares. They sat in stunned silence. The evidence was fragile, a house of cards built on guesswork and fear. It would not convince the consensus. A Velm technocrat would rightly point out that the visual could be radiation static. The audio could be interference, given meaning by traumatized minds. But they both knew. Commander Kim's hollow eyes now made a terrible, perfect sense. He hadn't been speaking in metaphors. He had been giving a tactical report. The enemy did not use plasma bolts. It used stories. And humanity's stories, it turned out, were full of monsters. The door to the archive hub hissed open. A Veln assistant, carrying a data slate, paused and looked at them. The analysis of the human vessel is complete, it stated flatly. All anomalous data has been attributed to synergistic radiation damage. The crew will be treated for shared psychotic trauma. This matter is concluded. The assistant left. Haniel looked at Gia. The unspoken truth hung between them, heavy and cold. The matter was not concluded. It was just beginning. They had peeked behind the curtain of reality and seen something ancient staring back. And now they had to decide what to do with a warning that sounded like a fairy tale, backed by proof that looked like a ghost story. The chamber of the galactic consensus was a monument to cold, rational grandeur. It was a vast amphitheater of polished, muted metals and soft, ambient light designed to soothe and to impose order. Representatives of a dozen species occupied their tiers, a living tapestry of strange biologies united by logic and treaty. Today the air hummed not with debate, but with a gentle, dismissive curiosity. They were here to listen to the humans and their odd little theory. A courtesy before closing the file on the Mumbai incident, Lee Haniel stood at the central presentation podium, her palms damp. Next to her, Park Jia manipulated a holographic display, her face a mask of forced calm. Across from them, on a raised dais, Ambassador Verl presided, his claws steepled. Commander Kim Tae-yeon sat off to the side, a silent, weary statue in a clean uniform that couldn't disguise his emptiness. "Esteemed delegates," Haniel began, her voice amplified to fill the quiet space. "We present correlative data suggesting the threat encountered by the Mumbai is not a known physical phenomenon, but a metaphysical one tied to narrative and belief." A soft, clicking ripple moved through the Velm contingent. A crystalline Cathar delegate emitted a low chime. A sign of polite confusion, G- brought up the recovered spectrographs, the jagged, shifting silhouettes from the dark. She overlaid the ancient etching of the Bulgasari. "The similarity in form is suggestive, but not conclusive," she admitted, preempting criticism. However, concurrent data streams show the ship's systems activating archaic subroutines based on Earth folklore during the event. The crew engaged in verbal wards. This is not standard emergency procedure. A silthy delegate, a shimmer of gas within a containment suit, pulsed with mild light. Its translated voice was serene. The human mind under extreme duress seeks familiar frameworks. This is a documented survival mechanism. You are describing psychosis, not an external threat. Haniel felt the ground slipping away. They were so reasonable, so calm. "With respect, delegate, the sensory data is corrupted," interrupted a Velm technocrat, rising from his station. He was a specialist, his shell marked with date node implants. His hologram showed the same Mumbai data, but filtered through standard consensus analysis. The terrifying shapes dissolved into amorphous clouds of particulate and energy discharge. The claw marks align with predicted stress fractures from a Tetryon cascade. The audio wards are harmonics of hull resonance. What you perceive as a monster, honored humans, is simply noise. The chamber seemed to agree. Postures relaxed. It was a neat, clean explanation. The humans, clever but fragile, had tragically mistaken cosmic weather for a ghost story. Ambassador Verl tapped a claw lightly. "The findings of our science corps are clear. The dark remains a hazardous region, but a physically explainable one. The human crew will receive the care they require for their imaginative trauma." This session is, wait. The word was not loud, but it cut through the chamber like a knife. It came from Commander Kim Tae-yeon. He had not moved, but his eyes were now fixed on Verl. The hollow look was gone, replaced by a flat, exhausted intensity. He stood up slowly, as if every bone ached. "You do not understand?" Kim said, his voice still rough, but now firm. "You are looking with the wrong eyes." Vorl's antennae twitched, a sign of mild irritation. "Commander, your trauma is acknowledged. There is no need. You asked how we survived," Kim continued, walking slowly to the center of the floor. He ignored the ambassador, his gaze sweeping the tiers of alien faces. "You have your theories. Radiation, hallucination. Let me show you what your machines call noise." He held up a small, black data chip. It was old, physical, not wireless. A ship's black box recorder. "This is the final protected log from the command deck. The core log. It is not corrupted." Before the technocrat could object, Kim slotted the chip into a universal port on the podium. Jia stepped back, giving him space. The hologram changed. It showed the Mumbai's bridge from the captain's chair perspective. The view was clear, but the scene was chaos. Warning lights flashed blood red. The crew was shouting, but not in panic. They were calling out coordinates that made no sense, yelling about shadows moving against the starfield. Then the lights died, plunging the bridge into emergency gloom. On the audio, they could all hear the same guttural, clicking snarl from the lower decks, but now closer, dripping with a hungry intelligence. Then, a new voice cut through. It was the ship's AI, but its tone was not the usual calm, digital cadence. It was rhythmic, chanting, using an ancient Earth dialect few humans even recognized anymore. It was a protective chant, a specific ward against a Jumio, a nine-tailed fox spirit that fed on life force. As the AI chanted, the sensor display beside the main viewport, which had been scrolling garbage data, suddenly spiked. A massive amorphous energy signature, right on top of them, flared and then recoiled as if struck. The recording stopped. The chamber was utterly silent. Kim pointed a finger at the frozen image of the spiking sensor. Your analysis calls that a Tetryon cascade. It is not. It is a reaction. That thing. Out there, it moved away when the AI recited the old words. It did not like the story. It did not like the shape of the belief. A Cathar delegate chimed, high and sharp. Correlation is not causation, Commander. The energy discharge could have been a natural repulsion. We tried plasma cannons, Kim said, his eyes blazing. We tried kinetic missiles. They passed through like the shadows they were. They fed the larger one. It grew stronger from our fear, from our belief in our own weapons. The only thing that made it hesitate was the story, the legend. We did not fight it with engineering. We fought it with mythology. And it worked. The dismissive atmosphere was gone, replaced by a chilly uncertainty. The evidence was irrational, impossible by the laws that bound the consensus. Yet the recording was clear. The timing was precise. The humans had done something inexplicable that had a measurable effect. Verl leaned forward, his diplomatic calm finally cracking into confusion. You are suggesting the universe contains beings that operate on the principle of narrative? I am suggesting, Kim said, his strength seeming to drain away, leaving him looking old and terribly sad, that the dark is a place where the rules are different, where thought has weight, where the oldest, strongest thoughts, the fears, the monsters, the stories we used to explain the night before we had lights can become real. It does not work on logic. It works on story, on belief. He looked directly at Haniel and Jie, then back at the silent, stunned aliens. It is the space where our oldest nightmares take form, and we have just woken one up. The chamber remained quiet. No one laughed. No one offered a polite, scientific rebuttal. The Velm technocrat stared at his own, now inadequate data streams. The Sylphi pulsed with agitated colors. They had come to humor the humans and close a case. Instead, Commander Kim Tae-yun had opened a door to a universe far stranger and far more terrifying than any they had ever imagined. The proof was not in a spectrograph or a radiation report. It was in the haunting, rhythmic chant of a machine against the dark, and the cold, simple truth in a broken man's eyes. For the first time, the galactic consensus had nothing to say. A subtle, unacknowledged tension settled over the consensus station like a fine dust. The official position remained unchanged. The Mumbai incident was closed. But in private corridors, during off-shift meals, the story of the commander's testimony was repeated. It caused uneasy glances and debates that ended not with conclusions, but with uncomfortable silence. The universe, once governed by neat, predictable laws, now felt vaguely uncertain. Engineer Yoon Chul was a man who lived in the certainty of numbers. He worked in the power distribution hub, a cavernous space of humming conduits and flickering status boards. He had watched the council session recording with professional disdain. Belief as a weapon? It was nonsense. There had to be a rational explanation, a hidden variable no one had measured yet. His curiosity, more than any belief, drove him to action. Using his system access, he pulled the raw energy logs from the moment the Mumbai had returned. Not the filtered, cleaned-up versions, but the dirty, unfiltered stream of data from the station's own external sensors as the wounded ship had approached. He also requisitioned, without proper authorization, the residual energy signature logs from the recent, troubling disappearance of the Consensus Patrol, the Shining Verve. Near the Dark's fringe, he worked alone in his maintenance office, the glow of his screens reflecting in his glasses. He ran comparisons, looking for a common particle, a known radiation profile, anything. For days, he found nothing but noise. Then he changed his approach. He wasn't looking for a physical signature anymore. He was looking for an effect. He modeled the energy drain on the Mumbai against the last known power levels of the Shining Verve. The pattern was not one of explosion or systems failure. It was a slow, steady siphon, as if something was drinking the energy, leaving behind a perfect, cold vacuum. But within that vacuum, his filters detected a faint, almost musical resonance. It was an echo, a shadow of a frequency. Yoon Chul isolated it. He cleaned it. He played it. The sound was faint and terrible, a chorus of whispers that seemed to slide away from comprehension. But buried within it, clear as a bell to his human ear, was a fragment. A voice, strained and screaming, not in a consensus language, but in Korean. It was a last, desperate fragment of a sentence. Butiora, Guyun Jiotulai. Beware, the lovely things. It was a line from an ancient poem, a warning about deceptive beauty. A chill that had nothing to do with the station's climate ran down Yoon Chul's spine. He cross-referenced the energy siphon pattern with the audio. The siphon spiked exactly when the human voice fragment peaked. The phenomenon wasn't just consuming energy. It was consuming context. It was feeding on the meaning, the emotion, the story behind the words. His rational mind fought against the conclusion, but the data was overwhelming. The entities from the dark, whatever they were not just physical. They were psychoreactive. They resonated with conscious thought, particularly with structured, potent narrative thought myths, legends, deep cultural fears. Human minds, with their ancient, vivid, and survival-focused mythologies, were like lighthouses in that dark. The Mumbai hadn't just escaped. It had blazed a trail of terrifying story stuff all the way home, and something had followed the scent. He was about to compile his findings when the station lights flickered. Not a power surge dip, a hungry dip. The great, steady hum of the gravity generators wavered for a single heart-stopping second. Alarms blared in the distance, then fell silent. The station-wide gong chimed. A calm, automated voice stated, "Unscheduled energy fluctuation in Sector G12. Maintenance alerted." No cause for concern. Yoon Chul knew Sector G12. It was mostly storage, low traffic, and it was directly adjacent to the docking spine, where the Mumbai was still held in quarantine. He pulled up the internal sensor grid for that sector. Thermal scans showed a spreading patch of cold, far colder than space should allow, seeping through a bulkhead. Motion sensors flickered, registering movement in empty corridors. The data was faint, hesitant, as if the sensors themselves were unsure of what they were seeing. He opened a COM channel to Central Security. "This is Engineer Yoon in Hub 3. I'm reading anomalous environmental data in G12. Possible intruder." The security officer, Aveln, responded with dry clicks. "Sensor ghosting, Engineer. We are detecting minor static on the lines since the human vessel docked. It is being investigated." "This isn't static," Yoon insisted, watching the cold spot grow on his screen. It's a pattern. It's a resonant echo of the Mumbai data. You have to seal the sector. Your concern is noted. A diagnostic team is en route. The channel closed. Yoon Chul sat back, his hands trembling. They didn't see it. Their sensors were built for physical threats, life signs, weapons fire, hull breaches. They were blind to this. The thing, the echo, the story made flesh, was here. It was moving through the station's walls like a rumor, feeding on the residual fear and attention left by the Mumbai's crew. It was learning the shape of its new home. He thought of the myth, the warning, beware the lovely things. What was taking form in the shadows of G12? A Guishan? A weeping, cold spirit of vengeance? Or something else, drawn from the darker corners of human imagination? He had to warn someone who would listen. He sent a frantic encrypted data packet to Lee Hanyul and Park Jia, containing all his findings. The packet was marked with a single line. It's here. It followed them. It feeds on the story. As he sent it, the lights in his own office dimmed. The screen flickered, and in the distorted reflection, he thought he saw something move behind him. Not a shape, but a presence, a distortion in the air, like heat haze off a desert, carrying with it a scent of ozone and forgotten graves. The station's defenses were silent. Its protocols were useless. The battle for the consensus station had begun, and the only weapons that might work were currently filed under human cultural studies. The dark had not just been explored. It had been awakened, and it had come to visit. The station was dying by degrees. Lights failed in patches, not with a spark, but by fading as if the light itself was being consumed. A deep, unnatural cold seeped through the lower decks, frost blooming on metal surfaces in intricate, feathery patterns that looked like claws. Consensus security teams, armed with plasma rifles, swept through the darkened corridors and found nothing. Their scanners showed empty space, yet crew members vanished, their last gasps over the coms a burst of static that sometimes sounded like a forgotten lullaby. Panic, a sharp and unfamiliar scent in the orderly station, began to spread. Lee Hanyul, Park Ji, and Yoon Chul found Commander Kim Tae-yun in a secondary engineering bay near the reactor core. He was not surprised to see them. He was pulling old fiber optic cables from a storage locker, his movements deliberate. The reactor, Yoon Chul said, his voice tight. The energy signature is coalescing there. It's drawn to the power, like a source. It's not just the power, Kim said, his voice calm for the first time since his return. It's the heart, the story of this place. We need to change the story. On a central terminal, they pulled up station schematics. The main reactor chamber was a vast, shielded cylinder. The access corridor leading to it was long and straight, a perfect funnel. It was where the station's final defense would logically make its stand. It was also, they realized, a perfect stage. We can't fight its story with weapons, Hanyul said, the idea forming even as she spoke. We have to fight it with a better story. A stronger one. Jia was already working, her fingers flying across a console. The station's comm system? We can broadcast on all channels, internal and external. But we need a narrative. Not just a ward. A saga. They worked in a frantic, focused silence. Yoon Chul patched their console directly into the station's primary communication array, bypassing failing security protocols. Hanyul began pulling texts, not just the warnings and the monster tailies, but the other stories. The old, deep stories of her people. The corridor outside the engineering bay echoed with the sound of metal twisting. The cold grew sharper. A shadow pooled at the far end of the hall, not cast by anything, but existing on its own. From within it, they heard a wet, clicking sound and a faint, mournful wail that seemed to pull the warmth from their bones. Now, Kim said .HANEUL opened a channel to the entire station. She took a deep breath, and instead of a warning, she began to speak. Her voice, amplified, rang through every corridor, every chamber, every helmet. This is Lee Haniel. Listen to me. Do not look at the dark. Listen to my voice. She began to tell a story. Not a child's simplified version, but the old, true telling of the mooned rabbit. She spoke of the rabbit who offered itself to a hungry god, throwing its own body into a fire to become food, and was rewarded with immortality in the moon for its pure, selfless sacrifice. It was a story of offering, of honor in the face of annihilation. Not as she spoke. Jia layered in sound, not electronic music, but the raw, rhythmic beating of a traditional Jianggu drum, pulled from a cultural archive. The drumbeat was a heartbeat, steady and defiant. The cold in the corridor hesitated. The advancing shadow seemed to ripple. Yung Chul took over. He spoke of Muzhang, the indomitable warrior spirit, the archetype that stood alone against a tide of enemies for the sake of others. He recited the epic of General Bei, who held a mountain pass with nothing but his will and a broken sword. His voice was not that of an engineer, but of a bard, weaving a tale of unbreakable defiance. Kim Taeyeon's voice joined next, deep and weathered. He did not tell of monsters. He told of Baridiji, the great shamanic heroine who journeyed to the underworld to plead for the lives of others, who faced the lords of death with cleverness and courage. He spoke of Buyong, the simple, unyielding courage of common people who stand when all seems lost. The station trembled. The thing in the corridor shrieked, a sound of tearing metal and broken glass. It was not a sound of pain, but of fury. The story they were telling was not one of fear it could consume. It was one of unity, sacrifice, and protection. It was poison to it. They reached the heavy doors to the reactor chamber. The entity was there, a swirling vortex of darkness and sharp, impossible angles. It had formed now a suggestion of multiple limbs, of glinting, cold eyes, a nightmarish blend of all the fears it had tasted. It pressed against a field of tangible terror, pushing towards the reactor's blazing heart. Haniel looked at her friends, at the weary commander. They had no more individual stories. They needed one last story, the biggest one. Together, they spoke. Their voices merged over the comm, echoing through the station and out into space itself. They spoke of Hongik Ingen, the foundational human ideal, to live for the benefit of all mankind. It was not a myth of a single hero, but the story of a people, a promise made to the universe at the dawn of their civilization. And then, Jia did one final thing. She queued up a file, the oldest, clearest recording she had. A single human voice, singing Ararung, the ancient folk song of sorrow, resilience, and enduring return. The melody, simple and haunting, filled the air. The entity recoiled as if struck by a physical force. The swirling darkness frayed at the edges. The song, the ideals, the drumming warrior heart, they were not attacks. They were a declaration of existence. They were the light of a campfire, and the thing from the dark was a creature that had never known light. It could not consume this. It could not understand it. The very structure of its being began to unravel in the face of such a coherent, powerful narrative of communal survival. On the Mumbai, still docked and powerless, Yung Chol's patjob activated. The ship's battered comm array, tuned to the frequency of their broadcast, amplified the signal 1,000-fold and directed it, like a focused beam of pure narrative, not at the entity, but back down the psychic trail towards the dark. With a final, silent shiver that resonated in the minds of every thinking being on the station, the entity dissolved. Not with an explosion, but like a nightmare forgotten upon waking. The cold retreated. The lights, timidly, flickered back to life. The silence that followed was profound. It was broken by the slow, steady return of the station systems. Beeping and whirring back to normal function. In the reactor chamber, the 4 humans slumped against the console, exhausted. The great door hissed open. Ambassador Verl stood there, surrounded by security. But the weapons were lowered. Voil's carapace was still frosted with lingering cold, his antennae quivering. He looked past them, at the now empty corridor, then at their faces. Pale and drained, but alive. He moved forward, his steps slow. He stopped before Commander Kim. The polite, diplomatic phrases were gone. When he spoke, it was with the raw simplicity of a being who had just seen his universe reordered. "Your legends," Verl said, the translation carrying a weight of awe and dread. They were not children's tales. He looked at each of them, the linguist, the archivist, the engineer, the soldier. They were warnings and weapons. The galactic consensus would debate this for cycles. The science corps would develop new theories, new sensors to detect narrative resonance. But on that day, in the quiet aftermath, the truth was evident. Humanity had not reemerged as a power of fleet or force. They had reemerged as the keepers of the oldest fire, the tellers of the oldest stories. They were the species that had, millennia ago, looked into the dark and whispered tales not just of the monsters they found there, but of the unbroken spirit required to face them. And now, the whole galaxy knew to listen.